Hello. I hope your LayerOne is going well so far. As well as it can, anyhow, given the plague. Welcome to How to Vet Your Vendors. Today I'll be explaining some tricks that you can use to gather intel on vendors if you find yourself in a role where you have to evaluate the security of vendors that your company wishes to do business with. Right off the hop, we have three big ones: Equifax, SolarWinds, and SonicWall. Three companies who were incredibly cavalier with their security posture and who eventually got popped because they did the least legally permissible amount of work. Today, we'll talk about how to potentially avoid being in that blast radius, or something like that. It is surprisingly straightforward, presuming that you have the time and the inclination, or if you want to just sleep better at night knowing that you're helping decision makers be better. So here's a little bit about me. I won't spend a lot of time here. You can pause this if you want, but the image is accurate. So the scope of this presentation is to cover specifically how to audit vendors that your company is bringing on board for one reason or another. Maybe they're going to host your company chat. Maybe they're going to maybe you're buying their anti-spam appliance. Maybe you're buying an HSM or an IAM solution. Maybe you're buying the HRIS system. The concept is that you're offloading some kind of business service that you do to a vendor, or that your company does to a vendor, or you're buying their software or hardware and you intend on running it in your environment day to day, or potentially you're buying a cloud-based service from them and you're going to use them for business reasons. The concept doesn't always work well when reviewing services organizations, largely because in many cases there just isn't a lot of surface for services organizations. They'll have some typical business use case stuff, email servers, DNS servers maybe, but not dozens and dozens of hosts. You should look anyway. There's a pretty good chance that you'll get some kind of read on how well they know technology based on what you find. So right now, the way that most businesses do vendor risk assessments is to send the vendor a spreadsheet full of questions, and essentially the vendors tend to just lie into it. This makes the insurance and compliance people happy, but it does absolutely nothing for security whatsoever. So despite knowing this, businesses continue to operate in this manner. There's a lot of pearl clutching and gasping that happens when the vendor that told them in the spreadsheet that they were hardened ends up getting in the news, like SolarWinds did. They like to feign surprise, but what's really happening in reality is that the business tends to do the absolute least amount of work that they can legally get away with, and the sentiment around this topic tends to be, who cares, we're insured, we're protected by contractual language and a platoon of lawyers, which makes the business risk people happy, but again does absolutely nothing to mitigate any actual risk whatsoever. When the lawyers are happy, it just means we have a defensible position from getting sued, not we're confident that we can repel firepower of some magnitude. So the whole endeavor here is just lip service to legal and compliance requirements. It's only done at all because businesses will put strongly worded language in their PCI SOX or HIPAA policies, and then when the auditors show up, they have to somehow figure out a way to demonstrate that they're actually doing what they say they're doing in those policies. And there's usually a lot of fidgeting and ums and ahs. So in many cases, businesses employ the use of what are called risk acceptance forms. And those tend to be another sort of hat tip towards the lawyers. In nearly every case, a risk acceptance form is a type of attestation saying, my business unit, the one that's making this absurd request, will take the responsibility of dealing with the outcome of bad stuff since we're casting security overboard and replacing it with these 2 paragraphs of text. The problem with this concept is that, again, in nearly every case, if something terrible does actually happen, it's not the business unit that has to deal with it, it's the company lawyers. It's interesting to me that nobody has caught on to that yet, or maybe they have and there's some arrangement that we can't see because the boundaries of these large orgs tend to be opaque, like Equifax, for example, who lied to Congress and got away with it. It's all smoke and mirrors to appease insurance carriers, basically. So all of that being said, what can we actually do about it? I know I've made it sound pretty bad, but surprisingly the answer is pretty easy and kind of fun. We do it ourselves. I see a lot of folks complain on Twitter that they don't get a chance to do the cool red team stuff in their jobs, but this is a perfect opportunity to get some sort of like diet version of that. You'll be able to play evil hacker and find terrible things. There's a lot of material that exists today for helping folks do bug bounties and a lot of open source intelligence work, as well as discovery and enumeration, and all of these skills on deck are on deck for this sort of assessment work. You can keep your skills sharp, and in many cases, it's good fun up until the part where you have to report your findings, because something like half the time, you're going to be raining on somebody's parade. So setting boundaries is important. It is unlikely that you'll be able to spend the amount of time that you want on any one of these given assessments, especially if there's a bunch of them to do. In many cases, you'll get stuck having to do 5 or 10. Sometimes the business will ask you to do like a shootout between several different vendors, and you're supposed to give them results that they have to choose the best out of 3 or what have you. It's not a pen test. You don't need to go deep. You don't need to penetrate anything or exploit anything necessarily. You just have to get an idea of what the surface is like and what their behavior is like from the equipment that they put on the internet. All you're looking for here are patterns of behavior. And there's a pretty broad spectrum of stuff to look for. There's also a handful of top-level categories that we can cover. Easy and fast ones, things like checking news websites for their org name. Have they been in the news at all recently? If so, why? Was it interesting or relevant? Did it give you pause? Can you find them on LinkedIn or Instagram? Do they have official accounts on various platforms? If they do, what do they post? Is it benign or does it worry you? Who's in charge? Is their CISO someone that was scraping barnacles off a rowboat 18 months ago? Do the people running the show appear to have any idea what they're doing? Have those people been in the news? This stuff is almost entirely just Google dorking, and this stage is just looking around for big public news that would measure up to being either good or bad. It's sort of the first layer of the onion. Next, we can get into more granular stuff like posts from employees on various social media platforms, evaluating what their digital perimeter looks like, seeing if they have devs and if those devs are leaking stuff, checking leak databases to see if they openly employ Nazis, for example. Sometimes you'll find nothing. Other times you'll find private SSH keys or rampant racism or abuse. Maybe Glassdoor has a bunch of complaints about them and that their head of tech support used to be the head of tech support for a cable company and was hired intentionally to make customers miserable. Maybe they're trying to stomp employees who are attempting to unionize. Maybe they really don't like gay people buying wedding cakes. Maybe they sell equipment to oppressive regimes that use that equipment to kill people. And maybe these sorts of things are things that you don't want any involvement with whatsoever. This stage will give you an idea of the sort of culture inside of the business and what the people do. What kind of people do they hire? How do they groom them? How does that interplay with the world around them and their customers? What happens when they have a good day or a bad day? If any of this stuff is discoverable, it's all interesting stuff that will somehow fit into your metric for how to decide whether or not to use this vendor. All this becomes relevant because if you're the gatekeeper of whether the business gets involved with them, it's up to you to be as informed as you can with these things, since the entire intention here is essentially to avoid surprises. Sometimes the things that you can find are really easy and straightforward. They will tell you a lot about how seriously a given company takes their own security, leaking certificates or internal assets, web servers with poor configuration or that leak sensitive files, lots of open ports that shouldn't be open or stuff that shouldn't be public, holes in firewalls poked to get to internal assets, devs and staging systems scattered all over the internet, usually super broken, exposed secrets, or like who puts dev and staging servers in the SIM? Like, why would you log those, right? So you can beat up on those all day and nobody will ever notice. The list gets really long really fast, but at this point, you're just sniffing for clues in the hopes of finding patterns of behavior that will give you an idea of what to put in your dossier. So there's an incredibly wide range of findings that you could be searching for, and largely they're going to depend on like what the company that you're investigating does, like what's their line of business. What you're looking for is evidence of either them doing stuff right or them doing stuff wrong, maybe somewhere in between, but that's the angle here. Some kind of measurable thing that will give you enough of an impression about how they behave, and if that's acceptable given the context of your business relationship with them, or the soon-to-be business relationship. The school of thought here is that the same people who maintain the equipment attached to the internet are the same people who maintain the equipment that's attached to the LAN. This obviously will vary, but it's not always exactly the same people. Maybe it's the same department. Maybe it'll be different departments depending on geographic location. In that case, there's a lot of wiggle room and configuration drift. So generally speaking, it may be one or two groups inside of an IT department who are all governed by the same rules. So if you spot terrible things on the perimeter, it means the business is okay with those terrible things being there because they were intentionally configured that way and made public. You can safely make the assumption that systems behind the network boundary are likely worse, since in very many cases, in nearly all of them, a company will only do the absolute bare minimum required by their compliance framework and nothing else. And nearly every one of those were written by accountants and lawyers, not technology people. So the language tends to be incredibly vague and give no direction for how to do stuff correctly. And often they're heavily abused and come peppered with gotchas, caveats, logical fallacies, and super fat assumptions. So a great thing to look for is ancient equipment and unpatched gear. If you find something like IIS 7 on the internet, or maybe IIS 8.5, that telegraphs quite a lot. Obviously, the business is okay with having that stuff. The business was okay with having stuff that will never get patched again, exposed to the internet, and they found some sort of like legally defensible way to argue that this somehow is okay, usually because of insurance or compliance, or this isn't in scope or whatever. There's a list of excuses that they can use that's a mile long, but at the end of the day, if you look at a place today in 2021 and they have Windows XP, 3-year-old versions of Juniper Pulse, LAN desk appliances, the admin interface to their PBX, and PHPMyAdmin, and a bunch of Samba ports open to the internet, it's a pretty safe bet. If you're planning on sending that vendor your data, it likely won't be safe for very long, because you can guarantee that if you were able to find all that stuff, other people can just as easily, and it's also very likely you weren't the first to find it. So maybe the thing that they sell is supposed to be the thing that you're buying, and maybe it's an on-prem piece of equipment. If the perimeter looks like that, you can bet that they put less security effort into the thing that they sell. Nobody's holding a gun to their head, so they just don't do it. Abandoned equipment tends to leak that the business isn't good about cleaning up their messes and will often be riddled with technical debt. Places like this get ransomware because they happily create attack surfaces that are publicly exposed. And the more stuff you have online, the easier it is for attackers to break in. And metric is pretty straightforward. If you discover some 5-year-old WordPress blog that you can trivially pop, chances are good that there are creds in it, and the chances that those creds are the current Active Directory password for whoever that user is are pretty high. And again, they're probably running OA, and they probably don't have 2FA, so here we are again. This category largely covers things like third-party hosting, cloud services, if they aren't a fully cloud shop already, or other third-party stuff that's not sort of their core business services, which have to be exposed to the internet. Dev servers, staging servers, test boxes, marketing campaigns, stuff that should have been decommissioned or cleaned up a long time ago, but instead were for some reason left to ferment on the internet, like a fine milk or maybe a durian. Oftentimes, you'll find internal hosts that are, for some reason, online. Holes poked in firewalls, stuff that labels itself intranet, either by hostname or SSL cert, or perhaps RFC 1918 addresses in public DNS that have really descriptive host names. I classify Jira and Confluence as this. Like if I can get at your main code repository from the internet, that's a bad thing. And if I can get at your main company wiki from the internet, that's also a bad thing. It means anyone else can. And those creds that someone left on that 400-year-old WordPress blog, they might work in Jira and Confluence. What about Jenkins, or what about Bamboo? That's how Verkada got popped, if you remember, that camera company. They had Jenkins on their perimeter, just exposed to the world, and someone noticed that the GroovyScript console was enabled and just one shot to shelled them. Then from there got into every single one of their customers' camera systems, including Amazon and Tesla and Okta. So things caught fire incredibly quickly. I get that everyone is going to cloud these days, but you know what else you can put in the cloud? Firewalls. Firewalls that have network segmentation and VPN capabilities. So just because there's a bunch of boxes in the cloud doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be all publicly accessible all the time. You can have stuff in the cloud structured logically, just like in a data center with network segments and security boundaries. That works. So if a company is leaving systems public, which are classified as both internal and cloud, this should telegraph a lot to you. They think it's cool to leave internal resources public, and if they are a vendor that is going to be housing your data, it is reasonable to assume that your data is going to live in those public servers, and that should probably give you pause. There's a story I could tell about that time I was part of the Hack the Pentagon bug bounty, and I found a Bluecoat proxy server on the USMC's network in Langley that was misconfigured to accept proxy requests from the public interface. So like, set your browser proxy to that IP and bam, suddenly you're proxying from the internet into their LAN because somebody checked the wrong box in the config. Maybe plug that into proxy chains and, I don't know, nmap that military network from the internet. If you find a web endpoint, check to see if it's a proxy. Sometimes you get really lucky. And in those circumstances, again, this finding telegraphs quite a lot. If you can get to their LAN like that, who else can or already has? You'll also run into the circumstance of where a large org has multiple offices in cities or countries, and those multiple offices will also have their own tech people. And those tech people may not see eye to eye. One group may be strong in Linux, another may be really strong in Windows, maybe Palo versus Cisco. There are a lot of different permutations here, but the concept is that when you have technologists that don't agree on stuff, and the business seems to have multiple technology personality syndrome, it seems to suggest that the people who operate in that space follow the "that's someone else's problem" school of thought. And in nearly every circumstance, the IT department will say security is someone else's problem, so this ends up being a sort of race to the bottom of who can do the least possible amount of work. Again, terrible for the security posture of a company as a whole, but it creates a bunch of fun places that you can shim attack stuff in. If you find a vendor exhibiting this behavior, don't be surprised if their support department is either complete garbage or friendly but unable to actually get anything done, because when you submit a request to that support department, it's going to go to their QA department or their IT people or what have you. Otherwise, a department that says, "this isn't my problem, send it somewhere else," to which they will begrudgingly send it somewhere else and get exactly the same response. So some interesting, colorful stuff that happens behind the scenes if for some reason tech support just never ever gets back to you. So let's do some live fire examples. As live fire as we can for this recorded talk. So this is Cellebrite, a company who recently was in the news because Moxie Marlinspike discovered that their hardware for taking data off of phones has absolutely no defenses in it whatsoever and is trivially exploited. So he wrote some exploits that popped the device and did this sort of proof of concept message box thing just as a show, but what it made clear was that Cellebrite didn't ever consider the security implications of plugging a device into their equipment that tried to hack it. Like, they never once configured that they would plug an iPhone into their equipment that I think it's running Windows, and that device could transmit malware. Like, the concept never occurred to them. I wonder what else they don't pay attention to. And having a look at their main website, we can see that it's just another unpatched WordPress blog, so their main corporate website, I guess. And in addition to a multitude of WordPress vulns, there's also like a debug.log file off their main domain that is available that leaks all sorts of details about their WordPress installation. You'd think a company that sells high-end security equipment to law enforcement would exhibit some decorum with regards to security, but I guess not. I spent maybe 15 minutes looking into Cellebrite when they made the news. I found a lot in 15 minutes. Another great one is Experian, who was also in the news recently for more huge data leaks. Surprise, surprise. There's some really telling stuff on their public perimeter. Like, here's one host that has .int in the host name for a bunch of subdomains that are all attached to one IP. And the screenshots show, it shows unconfigured IIS and super verbose error messages all on the same host. And I see a lot of help desk stuff, account management stuff all on this one IP. So in theory, if you shell this host, I imagine there's a bunch of nifty stuff on there ranging from passwords to user info, possibly help desk, trouble tickets. What goes into those, do you think? I don't know, SSL certs, VPN creds, use your imagination, lots of fun stuff. Oh, and if you pop that host, there are several dozen RFC 1918 addresses that they put in their public DNS for some reason. So great, you pop the help desk API, and once you breach that server, in theory, now you have access to their LAN, and now you have access to these hosts, which you know exists, and now you know its IP because for some reason it's in their public DNS. Like, whoever admins their DNS doesn't get the DNS as public, and putting private address information in public DNS is leaking data about their LAN. These are just two hosts, obviously, for Experian, but you get the idea. If this is what their perimeter looks like, and their perimeter is supposed to be hardened because it's connected to the internet, imagine what their LAN looks like. Having learned this about Experian, do you feel comfortable with them holding onto your data? Do you think that if you and some friends circled up with some laptops on a weekend and turned their WAN into your own private CTF, you'd get a high score? I mean, I'm not saying go and do it. I'm saying, you remember Family Fun Center? That. Oh, and in the case of if networking doesn't do it for you and DNS doesn't do it for you either, then here's a site apparently they have on their WAN that allows you to change a user's password if you know their current password. So, there's something like 2.5 terabyte of password leak data just floating around on the internet you can just get for free. What could possibly go wrong? Right, so you have to do this for 10 or 15 orgs in a short period of time, and you might get stressed out. These things are kind of sort of like mini pen tests, but without the actual exploitation. You're just scoping stuff out to get an idea of what sort of nonsense you could be in for. And you won't always find complete trash fires. Sometimes you'll find one host and a site, or maybe 4 or 5 hosts and no open ports. There are legitimately some hardened shops out there. They may only turn up 1 out of every 10 or 20 times, and they are a pleasant surprise. They do exist, but they are few and far between. It is, though, this is a bunch of work. So we at Phobos, we automated this because we do this quite a lot. our product is engineered to do this largely so that we don't have to do it by hand anymore. So every angle I've talked about so far in this talk has been a thing that we built into Orbital. So this isn't really like a vuln finder tool, not exactly. I've referred to it as sort of a divining rod for shells. It's not going to make the compliance auditors very excited, but it'll probably make the red and blue team's eyebrows do a little dance. So the TLDR here is basically that we're doing like a threat model specifically for the relationship between your business and the vendor. It's a very limited one, and for the narrow circumstance of like what happens is if this vendor gets popped or otherwise has some huge issue, how is that going to impact my company? Who is the vendor? What are they going to be doing for you? What data are you going to be letting them have access to? What will they be doing with that data? What happens if they have a problem involving your data? What happens if they have an insider threat and that person has access to your data or your network? Will they have physical access to your office or your data center? Like, put your bad guy hat on and imagine if you were this vendor and you wanted to do damage to your company, what would you do? What data would you go after? Would you go after people? Would you go after data, systems, spoofing, phishing? The world is your oyster. Use your imagination. Write that all down because that's now your threat model. Glue that to your dossier and turn it in with your findings. The folks who make the decision on whether or not to pay this vendor for their services will very much appreciate knowing what specific flavor of fucked they could get if things go pear-shaped. And in nearly every case, the whole point of this stuff is to avoid surprises. You could also consider a tabletop exercise. What scenario could you invent that could involve this vendor? Could they introduce ransomware to your network? Could they steal your data? Could they blackmail people? What could you do to deal with it or recover? Are there boundaries or contingencies stopping you from being able to react in the event that something bad happens? Do you have a disaster recovery plan? Do you have a crisis management plan? What if your first plan fails? Do you have a plan B? This is where things get pretty interesting, and this is where things start to intersect with like the red team world, because in doing this kind of work since 2008, I've never once heard of a red team scenario or exercise where the narrative is like, so your offsite backup vendor got popped and the attackers got access to hash dumps because you back up whole VMs of your domain controllers, or the chat tool that you use was compromised and it turns out that they actually lied in that vendor security assessment spreadsheet you sent to them, and they actually store everything in plain text on disk. So all of your chat logs and all your file attachments are just somewhere on some ext4 partition they can just grab. Maybe these sorts of gigs do happen. I just have not heard of them happening. So at least from where I'm sitting, this is sort of uncharted waters. So ultimately, at the end of the day, you have to make a decision of whether or not to do business with this vendor you're investigating. And given the findings that you've learned about the vendor, do you think that the risk is too high or not, or somewhere in between? Do you feel better or worse about the vendor having investigated them? All of this goes in your dossier. So in a perfect world, there would be guardrails around onboarding of a new vendor, since black box appliances and on-prem software have quickly become sort of the darling attack vector of 2021. These scenarios are super fun and super cool to play out in like a role-playing or tabletop sort of thing, or if you can somehow work them into a red team gig, these are really juicy things that not a lot of people get to walk that path because it makes businesses incredibly nervous. If you have the opportunity to do this stuff in-house, I highly encourage you to do it because you can get incredibly creative. Everyone is going to have a really good time, and it's a fantastic way to get various teams to work together and learn from one another. One of the best and most lucrative sort of learning experiences you can have using this sort of framework is to sort of come up with like a D&D type scenario and pit red team versus blue team against one another, or create a scenario whereby you have the red team and the blue team discover a live attacker in an environment and now have to sort of work together to fend off this sort of common enemy. It's a fantastic way to get into all the various permutations of how weird stuff can go sideways, and it'll give both maybe 3 teams, 4 teams, however many there are, a great opportunity to come up with fun, weird stuff on the fly, and all of that fun, weird stuff that comes up ends up going into the threat model. And the more robust these endeavors become, the more sort of everybody wins, because at the end of the day, the objective is to sort of move forward safely. So hopefully you found this useful. I'll be around for questions, and thank you very much.